Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. Appreciate it. My name is Mac Terluccio. For those of you that don't know me, for those of you that do, hi, everybody. I want to welcome you to this guest speaker event for Entertainment Business in LA Film School. Really appreciative that you're all here. Without any further ado, here is Professor Lloyd and Michael Price.
Before I introduce my good friend here, I just want to say a little bit of history about Michael Price. Some of you might already know that besides being the executive producer on The Simpsons and writer, which is going on its 30th year this year, right? Okay. He is also creator of the new F is for Family, which is going into its fourth season. We're right now in their third, right?
Three seasons are on Netflix now. We're writing the fourth one right now.
But his history goes further back, going into Lego Star Wars, Teacher's Pet, PJs, Hercules, the list goes on and on. But he didn't just wake up one day when he was in college and be, hey, I'm going to be writing for Simpsons. Right? It just happened to be part of his journey. And those of you that have also had me in class as a teacher and instructor, we always talk about everybody has a journey. Sometimes where you think you're going to go right now, you're looking at it this way, you don't know where that's going to take you as you go on in your careers. And as long as you're open to the journey, you'll have so many amazing opportunities. So I want to start with talking about your journey, Mike, a little bit about where that started for you.
Mm-hmm. Well, I grew up in New Jersey, hence the Mets hat, and
Jersey in the house.
This was back in the that's right. This is back in the day, long ago, when there were like 3 TV stations. There were maybe 4 or 5, and I just loved watching TV. I loved old movies. I loved everything to do with Hollywood, so I still can't believe that, like, here we are, like, near like Sunset and Vine in Hollywood, and I didn't really know what that meant or how that could turn into a thing or a career or a life. I just knew that I loved it, and I had kind of a brain for like learning the names of actors, and I would watch old TV shows growing up, like Green Acres or The Addams Family, and I would know the name of the actors and I could say with it who they were, and that was not really a skill that is marketable. But but then I turned into becoming a theater major in college. I went to Montclair State College. It's called University now, but in New Jersey, as a theater major. And then went to graduate school for theater at Tulane University, where I learned to be a director. So I have an MFA in theater directing. After that, I came back to New Jersey, and I hooked up with some friends of mine. We had a very small theater company where we kind of did everything ourselves, built the sets and acted in it, directed in it, occasionally wrote some stuff. And that was the first writing I did, was sort of taking these plays, some plays, and kind of adapting them. An old Greek comedy called The Birds by Aristophanes that a professor of mine at Tulane had done a version of. I took his version and kind of readapted it and wrote it away. So I was kind of learning how to write, not knowing that that's what I was doing. And as part of that as well, I was always very fond of comedy, specifically like Saturday Night Live comedy, or if you're familiar with SCTV, Second City. And so I knew I loved that stuff, and I was a student of that whole genre. And I got involved in New York City with an improv comedy group called Gotham City Improv that's still there. And they were kind of like a New York version of what the Groundlings, which is still here. At that time, the Groundlings was pretty much the be-all and end-all of comedy in LA. Now UCB has kind of taken over them as sort of the place to go if you want to learn how to be a comedy writer or do comedy or sketch comedy improv. But I was doing it there, and it taught me, in these classes that you took, you sort of learn how to be a writer there, where you take these kind of improv games, and then in the course of this improv game, you come up with something funny, or a funny idea, or a funny line, or maybe a funny character, and the teacher would say, okay, now go home tonight and write a scene for that character, or write a monologue for that character that you came up with just in the middle of this dumb thing. And so that's what we learned. I learned how to sort of take a spontaneous idea and then go home and actually write it on a typewriter or a computer. And because of that, then I learned how to sort of write comedy sketches, like SNL-style comedy sketches. And Through that, I made friends with a woman, and we became kind of like a writing team, and we wrote a show that we performed together that was sort of about a couple, the journey of a couple on their relationship from like their first date to breaking up. And she was much more focused on like a career advancement, and I had a real plan about, we're going to do this show, we're going to do it in New York, we're going to get people who like it, we're going to find people who want to be our agents, they're going to tell us that we're going to go to Los Angeles, we're going to get an agent in Los Angeles, we're going to get people to see us, we're going to become famous, and we're going to become TV stars. So I was like, oh, sounds good, sounds good. You know, so I had
She's producing this whole thing before you even get
yeah,
started.
she was. I mean, she really was very focused that way, and which was great because I didn't really know anything. So, on the basis of that, we had the show that we developed for a long time. Did it in New York, made some connections with people who knew some people out here, and we just basically just drove across the country out here, just more or less sight unseen, with a couple of contacts here. And those contacts did help us a little bit. They helped us get an agent, which is the hardest thing to do, you know, is to get the agent. So that was the first thing we did, which was, we didn't really realize at the time. We're like, oh, we got an agent now. I mean, now, all these years later, I realized, like, wow, what a stroke of luck that was. And they put us up. We did some showcases at the Comedy Store. This is many years ago now. And we had everybody in town come to see us, like, because our agent, like, worked the phones, and we got NBC, CBS, ABC, Fox. All the studios came to see us, everybody, and we were dynamite. Our show was great, and then we had all these meetings like the next couple of weeks, and it was this time of year, which is they call like development season, which is that's when pilots are sort of being developed, and we had all these meetings like stars in our eyes, and absolutely zero happened because we weren't really ready for the next step, which was they wanted us to come in and pitch them ideas for sitcoms. We thought they were going to hand us, like, say, okay, here's your show. You know, you are now a TV star. So we weren't ready for it. Our agent could have helped us a little bit better, and we kind of floundered. We literally, like, we were like the flavor of the month for less than a month, you know, for a couple of days. And we just hit the wall, and nothing happened. And it was very disappointing and deflating. And we kind of split up our act after that, and she was more focused on performing. She was a great performer. I liked the writing better. There was no way I was going to go back to New Jersey, like, with my tail between my legs. So I just stuck it out, and I learned how to be a writer, which is like I got scripts. There used to be a place, I don't know if it's still here or not, like Larry Edmonds. Is that still here, the bookstore? This is before the internet. This is even before this is how long ago this is. This is before the internet, where
It
you would
still
go to a
exists. They
store.
still have places you
would
can
go
go.
to a store where you could buy scripts from things, and you could see, like, this is what a script looks like. I think my agent got me a couple of scripts for, like, Murphy Brown or something to look at. So then I learned how to write spec scripts. So I wrote spec scripts for all the shows that were big in the early to mid '90s, and I just trained myself to, like, write that way. And luckily, I had the agent, and he was sending me out for stuff. It took me another couple of years before I finally got some work. And I got work based on a packet of sketches I had written. And my first job was on a very low-budget sketch comedy show, a TV show. But it was my first job, and I was so thrilled, and it was so exciting. And I met people there who were also new writers on the staff, who then a guy said, oh, you know, when that show ended, he goes, oh, I'm working on a show at Nickelodeon, an animated show at Nickelodeon. We're looking for some writers for that. Would you want to be interested in that? And I was like, yeah, sure. So I went into that, and that show was, some of you kids may have been kids when it was on. It was called Real Monsters. It was on Nickelodeon. So I wrote a whole bunch of episodes of that, you know, so I met people there, and I just continued working and continued making connections of people who then helped me get other jobs.
And that's when I just wanted
Yeah.
to just highlight that, because we talk a lot about how important networking is, how important
Very,
it is
very
to,
much important.
you can send things out to people over and over again, but that doesn't necessarily going to open the door. You physically have to be there, you have to get
Yeah.
yourself out there, network, meet people, make those connections.
Yeah, and I literally took any job, anything that came along. I was a little bit older than most other people were, because most people, even a lot of people now, you know, will come out like right out of college, you know, or, you know, like to be in their early 20s or so. I was in my early 30s when I moved out here. So I was like, I had this feeling of like there was a time bomb, like there was a ticking clock on everything, you know. So, and also because I was so happy to be working, and I would just take anything, anything. Like any job you want to give me, I was taking because I wanted to make money, but I also just wanted to keep working. And that led to other things. And eventually I kept writing spec scripts. I kept doing animation. And then eventually I wrote a spec script for a show that was called News Radio that was on in the mid-90s. That was a really great sitcom. And that got me an entree at Disney. And then the person at Disney liked it, and they were looking to staff a show on the old UPN network, which doesn't exist anymore, but it was called Homeboys in Outer Space, and it was a very silly show, like kind of a space satire, whatever, goofy show, but it was my first like network sitcom, and I was so happy to be on that, and that led to, I met people there, long story, much shorter now, because I know I don't want to take the whole time, but that's a show that if you Googled it, you will see it's listed on like the list of like worst shows of all time, whatever. It's a punchline, you know, it's no Homeboys in Outer Space, whatever, you know. But there were a lot of great writers on that show, and two of the writers on that show, they weren't full-time writers, but they had an overall deal at Disney, and their names are Al Jean and Mike Reiss, and they had been the showrunners in The Simpsons, the third and fourth season, and they then created a show called The Critic, and then they had an overall deal at Disney to develop shows. But I got to know them on that show. They worked on it 2 days a week, and they liked me. And then they got their own show the next year. It was called Teen Angel for ABC, and they hired me for that. And then, 3 or 4 years later, I was working on other things, and they both went back to The Simpsons, and Al became like the main showrunner of The Simpsons again. And so I was working on a whole other show that was about to get canceled, and I got a call from Al Jean. He's like, Mike, what are you doing? I was like, I'm on the show. I think it's going to get canceled. And he's like, well, if it does, let me know, because there's a slot open for you at The Simpsons. So if I hadn't been on Homeboys in Outer Space, I would never have been on The Simpsons. So it's like, I always tell anybody, people starting out, like, you never know what that thing is going to be for you. Like, don't turn your nose down at a job. Take it. You never know who you'll meet. You'll never know who's going to be your Al Jean or what your Homeboys in Outer Space will be.
So now that we are up to The Simpsons,
Yeah.
one thing that I'd love to talk a little bit more about that is the show's been on for 30 years.
Yes.
Okay. How do you keep the show so fresh? How do you realize, well, we're going to write this, no, but that was written 25 years ago,
Yeah.
episode 5, season this. How do you make sure
Yeah.
you're not double doing things that you've done?
Well, luckily, Al, who's still our showrunner, has an almost computer-like memory of everything, because he's worked on the show more or less since day one, off and on. We have the internet, of course, now. We used to have these books. We have to look at these big books saying, well, was there a show about this? But now it's all out there. But so that's one thing, is like you try not to repeat what's been done before, but it's difficult because we're up to 660 episodes or so right now. But it's also like finding new things. There's new, the world keeps changing, so The Simpsons kind of always, I feel, is sort of responding to what's going on in the world today. So now we're doing episodes, like we did an episode about, it was on recently about Bart being involved in esports. So there was no such thing as esports 30 years ago, but now there is. So there's things about what's going on in the world now, or it's finding new aspects of characters that you didn't know were there before. Sometimes it's just literally just a germ of an idea that turns into a thing. And I'll tell you, the most recent episode that I wrote that was on about a month and a half ago was based on just a thought I had. And I thought of this like 6 years ago, and I couldn't quite figure out where to go with it, but it was always an interesting idea for me, which was that the little thought was that Grandpa Simpson was the photographer's model for the little green army men that you buy when you're a kid. So I thought that might be funny if you found out that Grandpa did that. So it took me a long time to figure out, but it turned into a whole story that I'm really happy with, that was about, that happened where Grandpa's playing with Bart and Lisa, and Bart brings out his army men, and Grandpa has kind of like a flashback, like a seemingly a war flashback, but what he's really thinking about is when he was standing there having his picture taken, as this army man. And then we said, look, what is that about? So then it developed into a whole story where it turned out that he had forgotten that this had happened, and he kind of blocked it. And then it's like, well, why did he block it? And then it turned out, we found out through developing the story that what happened was the photographer back in 1948 or whatever was a closeted gay man who thought that Grandpa was sort of like romantically interested in him, so he made a pass at Grandpa, and then Grandpa, being a guy of 1948, freaked out and ran out of there in a panic, and because of it, the guy was kind of outed at his job, and he lost his job, and so when Grandpa finds that out, he feels really terrible and feels guilty about it. And he tracks the guy down where he lives now. He's now older, like Grandpa. He lives in this beautiful place in Texas called Marfa, Texas, which is like an arts community. And Grandpa says, "I'm sorry I ruined your life." And he goes, "You didn't ruin my life. You helped me because you kind of forced me out. And ever since then, I've always been happy to be who I am, and I'm an artist now." And it became like a really wonderful story, but it was just based on that little idea I had one night about it would be funny if Grandpa was an army man. But that's sort of how you develop stories.
And do you have like because I know that you have a writing team. So when you have
There's a giant staff.
Right.
Yeah.
And so how is that? Because I know you have a whole team of people. Does everybody write on one particular episode? Is people designated for a particular episode?
Well,
How
on
do
The
you normally do
Simpsons,
that?
we have 1 or 2 days a year where it's time to come up with to present new story ideas. So it's called the Story Retreat, and we all gather in a giant room, and we're with our bosses, who are Al and Matt Groening and Jim Brooks, who's our the ultimate uber boss of the whole show, and everyone has a chance to say, "Here's a story I want to do," and you pitch the story. So I pitched that story about Grandpa and the Army Man. My original version did not have the other angle about the photographer. That was something that came out of after I pitched it. Jim Brooks, my pitch of it was that once Grandpa figures out that he had been this guy, he realizes that he's been cheated out of like millions of dollars of like residuals or whatever because of it, and he sues the company and he wins the company, and he runs the toy company, and the whole second half of the show was about how has Grandpa run a toy company. And so Jim Brooks listened to the idea. Everyone loved the initial pitch about him being the Army Man, but Jim said, "That seems like it's too big of a thing. Like, he's just a regular guy. Like, he shouldn't be running a whole company. Like, let's find a smaller end to this story." And I forget who it was. It might have been Jim. Somehow we landed on this whole other thing about the photographer, and that's sort of what happens. And then I write the script. I go off and write a whole draft of the script, turn it in, and then it belongs to the whole room. And Al, who's the showrunner, makes notes. And then we spend a very long time, like a week or two, sometimes 3 weeks, just working through the script, one line at a time, one page at a time, making it better, rewriting it, and then doing like many drafts of it before it goes into production. But then by that point, everybody's involved. And so then on every other script, I'm one of the guys in the room just pitching jokes on that person's script.
I want to now fast forward a little bit to your show.
Yes.
Show that, yes, look at you. Yes, my show.
That's right.
So I want to get a little, because a lot of students in here are also writers, producers, they're directors. I want to focus a little bit on, first, how you came up with this whole concept. How did you give birth to this? And how did you specifically develop your character? What was the character development process through all this?
Well, this one came about, I'd long been interested in writing about my childhood and my neighborhood in New Jersey. And 20 years ago now, the very first pilot I wrote was sort of about a lot of the similar characters and stuff that are in F is for Family now. And it was about my dad, like a fictional version of my dad, who is not at all like the dad in F is for Family in that he like yells and screams. Like, my dad did not yell and scream, but he had a lot of internalized anger, and he'd get frustrated at things, and he would curse at the TV and things like that, But I wrote about it, and it never went anywhere, and I always felt like, oh, I wish I could find a way to do it. And then what happened was I got a call, this is now going back almost 7 years, from my agent saying, was I interested in having a meeting about this thing? And it said, there's this guy named Bill Burr, who's a stand-up comedian, and he's trying to develop an animated show based on his act and his childhood. And back in the 1970s, and I was like, that sounds great. That sounds like the thing I've been trying to do forever. And I didn't really know who Bill was. Now, of course, I'm so happy to work with him, and he's one of the great stand-up comedians of all time. If you ever have a chance to see him, he's incredible, and a great actor, too. But I had a meeting with him, and this was developed through a production company called Wild West Productions, which is run by Vince Vaughn, the great actor Vince Vaughn. And his producing partner, his name is Peter Billingsley. And so I had a meeting with Bill. I met Bill, and we just sort of told stories about our family, his dad, my dad, and I told a very specific story. Sort of what I got to you, which is about how my dad would not blow up and yell and scream at us, but he would find ways to get his anger out at other things. And so there used to be a commercial on TV long ago for the cigars called White Owl cigars, where the guy in the cigar ad would say, like, you don't smoke White Owl cigars, but if you do, if you take one puff, you will be hooked. We are gonna get you, like that. And he was kind of very smug about it. And he goes, oh yeah, we're gonna get you, we're gonna get you. And my dad must have had a really bad day that day for some reason. I don't know why, but he yelled at the guy on the TV. A guy on the TV. He goes, "You're not going to get me, you son of a bitch." You know. So it's just like there's like a whole volume, a whole life in that line. You know. And my brothers and I were there that day, and we both looked at each other and kind of like laughed at my dad. And I'll never forgot it. So I told Bill that story, and later on he goes, "That was the story that made me want to." Knew that you were the guy to do this show. So, but then what happens was that we had Bill had a very basic idea of who the father was based on his own dad. His own dad says all those things like, I'm gonna put you through that wall and stuff like that. And that it would be in the 70s, and that it would be sort of generally what it's about, which is about like a family guy, a blue collar guy, dealing with frustrations of that time. And then it was up to me to sort of then take it and sort of say, okay, what else could it be about? Who are the other characters? What is the story about? All we really had was a pilot story. And if you watch the first episode of it, there's a thing where the kid comes home with a magnet from school, and he accidentally puts it on top of the TV and ruins the TV. And that's a real thing that happened to my brother did that. Like he had a big bar magnet from school, and he brought it home and put it on the TV. And old TVs in those days, it was a really heavy TV too. So, but he ruined the TV, like it blitzed it out. So I pitched that, and we made that the pitch for the first story. But then it was like developing who the other characters in the neighborhood were, and those were all based on people from my neighborhood. There's a weird guy in the show named Goomer, who's the creepy guy who looks in everybody's window. He's based on a guy, our weird neighbor who looked in everybody's window, and things like that. And then there was a guy. Then the part of the production process. Once we got it going, we produced it through an animation company in France called Gaumont Animation, based in Paris. And part of the reason was that there was a French tax credit that you could get from producing the show in France. So it enabled us, you know, our meager budget was helped because we got a tax credit. But in order to qualify for the tax credit, we had to meet certain criteria. So like a certain amount of people on the show had to be based in France. We couldn't say what state we were in the United States. That's why if you watch the show, like we never mentioned the state. So it's kind of like The Simpsons, but like for just a purely monetary reason. And the other thing was we had to have a character. We had to have a character who was a semi-regular character who was either French or European. And we were like, how are we going to do that in our little all-American town? And I remembered a guy from my neighborhood who was Japanese, and this is back in the 1970s when we were all just white kids, and we were so ignorant, we didn't know anything. And I think every kid has that person in their neighborhood where kids make stories about them and say like, he's that guy, he's evil, he will kill you, you know. And for whatever reason, this sweet little man, his name was Mr. Otani, who like was just a sweet man who would just dig in his rose garden. He was that guy in our neighborhood, and I don't know why. Like us 6 or 7 year olds would be like, he's gonna, don't, you know, he's whatever, he will kill you. You know? So we turned that into our character named Mr. Altenwasser, who's the nice, sweet little German Holocaust survivor, who they all think is Hitler's brother or whatever like that. But that's the only reason that character was created was to satisfy this tax credit. But then we ended up loving him, and at one point we were going to try to call him. We were looking at like what is the German name for tax credit. We were going to call him like Mr. Tax Credit. But we came up with the name we liked. But that's sometimes things come up. Sometimes things are created out of necessity like that, and sometimes those are the best things. I absolutely love that guy. He's my favorite character almost on the show.
How do you? Because you're also showrunner on
Yes.
this. So how does being a showrunner, being a director, different on an animated show as compared to doing it for live?
Well, first of all, when you're a writer of an animated show, it's like you're directing it because you almost have to write with camera angles in mind. I used to work at Disney Animation on some of their Saturday morning style shows where you really were required to like write close up on, angle on. So you're kind of like a director there, like from a visual director. But as the showrunner, you're also thinking about like, everyone says like animation can be anything, and it can depending on the budget. Like The Simpsons has a very, very large budget. So we'll do those shows like the Halloween show where like one segment is in old England and one segment is in space and one segment is in hell or whatever like that. But that takes money because that's people creating backgrounds and designing characters. So on our show, we have to try to limit that. We're limited just as well. It's not like no one's actually building a set, but someone is drawing this thing. So we have to try to sort of, that's in my mind. If we say like we're at a football game, we can't have, there's no time for someone to draw like 10,000 people, so we'll have to find a creative way to sort of suggest that they're at a football game without actually doing it. So that's part of what's going on in my mind, and also in terms of like acting and how many people can we hire, how much money do we have for the budget for guest characters. So it's all going on in my head as I'm also trying to be creative and write the show.
If you're up for this, I'm ready to open it up
Absolutely.
for some Q&As
Certainly.
for some students who might have some questions. I just want to kind of limit the question, so if you have a question, please limit it at first to one question, not one question with 3 questions attached to that throughout it, so that we can give others a chance, and then we could always reroute back. Does that sound cool? Yes? Yeah. All right. So can let's see a show of hands at some questions?
There's one
yes.
right there.
So you just spoke with regards to the role of executive producer and wearing both creative and business affairs hat. Can you speak a little bit more to the sort of harder skills, business and legal aspects that you've had to learn across the way, and how you've balanced both the creative hat with the business side of things?
Sure.
I think the students would be interested to hear that.
Yeah, because if it was just me writing in a vacuum, I could write anything. But like we're dealing with a thing right now, actually, in our upcoming 4th season, where the character of Kevin, who Justin Long plays, meets a girl who's kind of like a nerdy girl who is into kind of the things that he likes. Like he has that band, that kind of prog rock band that's called Shire of Frodo. And then she says, "Oh, I love Shire of Frodo too, because they're really literary with their allusions to like J.R. Tolkien and The Lord of the Rings." And then she hands him a book like The Fellowship of the Ring, and he's amazed to think like, "Oh my God, Frodo's in a book," because he's not too smart. So, but we just had to deal with that very issue because the Tolkien estate is very protective of their copyright. So we had a bunch of lines where she was quoting from the book. I'm not a huge. I know enough about it, but I couldn't tell you. But she's quoting from the book. We can't quote from the book because that's copyrighted material. We can't show whatever. So that's why there's no they wear a T-shirt in the show called "This is Shire of Frodo," but we can never sell that T-shirt because Frodo is owned by Tolkien. So it's things like that. So we have to find a workaround like that. Like we have to find a way to sort of refer to things. He can say things that happened in the book, but you can't say it exactly. Or like we want to use a song. There's a lot of great songs, but we have a very limited music budget. So we have a really amazing music supervisor named Bruce Gilbert, who will find like obscure songs. Bruce? He's amazing. He finds these incredible songs that are relatively inexpensive for us. So for instance, like we did get one song, Earth, Wind and Fire song called Shining Star, which is a really great song. So we needed that for an episode. And so it was like, I hope we can get it. And he's like, we got it, but it's gonna cost $30,000 out of our budget, which is a lot of money. But if we wanted to get like a Beatles song or whatever, it would be 100,000 or whatever like that. So certain shows like on HBO or something have unlimited music budget. We don't. So Bruce will find a good song that we can use. So there's the thing called Killer Tracks, which is another thing, which is like kind of a music library where it's very cheap, but you'll find some stuff like that. So like we have to be that kind of creative and make shortcuts and things like that, or reuse a set that we already used for something else. But yeah, so I'm always juggling that stuff in the back of my mind.
Other questions?
Yes.
Hello, my name is Daryl Kennedy.
Hi.
I first want to thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate your
thank
time
you.
and all of your advice and stories and anecdotes. I did want to ask you, you work in two very different worlds, currently working with The Simpsons, which is a very famous broadcast show, but now you have your own series that is strictly streaming.
Yes.
How do you split your minds in those two fields, and how do they also kind of work together and help you benefit both sides?
That's a great question. Well, I think without The Simpsons, I think I wouldn't have been able to have the wherewithal to do the show I'm doing now. And a lot of my training at The Simpsons has translated into FS for Family, where, especially in terms of the creative stuff, where like we try to make everything funny and like sign jokes, and if you watch FS for Family. And the other thing that's interesting with streaming is that we found that we have fans of the show who've watched every episode maybe like multiple times, and so they're always going back and finding new things. So we're always like really mindful of now of putting things in. So whenever there's a newspaper, if there's even the newspaper is on the screen for like a second, because we're in HD as well, so we will write the article, like one of us writes an article, so that's full of jokes. So if you go back, you'll see everything is, and some of the things are like setting up stuff that, like there'll be a newspaper that's on the doorstep in episode 2, and it's setting up a character that we'll meet in episode 8, because we're able to, that's the other thing, because on The Simpsons, because each episode of The Simpsons is its own self-contained thing and could come out at any time. There's no rhyme or reason, there's no arcs or anything like that.
standalones.
Yeah, they're all standalones, and that's The Simpsons style, which has served it amazingly well for 30 years. But with us, we're serialized, so we're Netflix, we're serialized, so each episode builds on the last. So, and the Netflix model is that all the episodes are released at once. So we're at, like, for instance, we just saw episode 1 is close to being ready to be animated, and we're about to have our final read-through of episode 10 next week, but now we're finding things, and so when episode 1 comes back from animation, we might have discovered something in the writing of episode 10 that would be, oh my God, that would be so amazing if we could find a way to sort of lay that in back in episode 1. So when that comes back later, we'll have a chance to sort of fix that and sort of add a thing that, so it's really interesting as we're finding stuff as we're writing the end of the season. We're now going back, we can revisit the beginning of the season and make it all happen. Whereas with The Simpsons, each episode comes out when it's ready. So it's kind of frustrating for us, because that's why often it takes so long between seasons. So like a season of our show comes out like roughly once every year and a half. And I know I see on the internet all the time, like, where's the next season, where's the next season? Because it takes that long. It does take it's a painstaking process to animate, but also to have all the shows have to be all completely finished before anyone can come out. So like number 1 will be ready like 7 months before the whole thing comes out. Yeah, whoever, yeah.
Hi, my name is Tess Potter, and I want to thank the Los Angeles Film School and Donna Lloyd for having you here with us today.
Sure.
The question I have for you is, I'm actually currently trying to create an animation series based off a Native American experience, and I don't really know when to stop with the pitch part of it. Like, what's enough to like start thinking it's okay to present to somebody?
Mm-hmm.
How far should I be going?
Oh,
with this?
that's a really great question. Well, pitching is a really interesting thing. Excuse me, I'm popping my piece. Pitching is really interesting because, yeah, I think depending on where you're taking it, I think it might depend. Like, if you're going to like a Netflix place, it helps. I think it helps them to know you want to present them with a really great idea, right? And also you're sort of presenting yourself as the person to do that idea, and you want to make them feel like you know what you're doing and that you've got an idea that could run for multiple seasons. It used to be with the network model, you'd want to do like a show that could be 100 episodes. Now it's like, we've been on, FS Family, we're now in season 4. We've been in production for 5 or 6 years, and we're up to like 30 episodes. So, but I think your pitch should be sort of like, this is what the idea is, this is why it's interesting, and also like have a thought of like where it goes beyond like the initial thing. So often you want to sort of pitch the pilot idea of it is, and then sort of you want to have sort of an idea and be able to present them an idea like, here's where it goes. This is what season 1 is about this, season 2 is about this. So the person you're pitching to can feel assured that like, this is the show that we want to invest time and money in to do it, And it also helps if you're doing an animated series to maybe have some artwork. If you have art, That's great. Yeah, you just sort of want to present, like, this is what the show is about. These are the characters. This is what you'll expect to see in the first episode, probably, and this is what you can expect to see as the series goes on. Yeah. Sure, that's good. Then sounds like you're good.
We'll get to you in the back next. I know you're jumping up and down. Okay. We'll get you next.
Hello,
Hi.
my name is Jeremy. Thank
Hi,
you for
Jeremy.
being here. You spoke on how The Simpsons was a show that kind of changes with the times and I guess reacts to that. So I remember a few specific episodes that I was wondering about. One being how you wrote about Donald Trump winning the election before he
Yeah.
actually won.
Yes.
And then the other being about Caitlyn Jenner pre-transition. So, like, how did that come up in your mind? Because it's not really predicting the future, but it's alluding to it.
Okay. Well, with Trump, I wasn't around for that episode, which came out about 20 years ago. I think he came out like in 1998 or 99. At the time, he was already well known. He was famous for being, this rich guy who put his name on everything. And I think he was already making rumblings about how he wanted to run for president in 2000, I think. So I know when the writer of that episode, Dan Graney, said that like they needed something funny to say, like that Lisa was going to be it was a future episode set in the future where Lisa became the president, and they wanted some kind of thing like saying like, well, we inherited a mess from the previous president, and everyone thought it'd be a hilarious joke. They would say it was President Trump, So I think that's but it wasn't exactly out of the blue. I mean, his name was being floated around at the time, so that's that. Sometimes, I mean, I'll say if a show's on for 30 years and 680 episodes or whatever, like you're bound to strike lightning a couple of times.
I kind of want to build off of that, though, with
Yeah.
a question, though, speaking of some of those that are also can be controversial. Have you ever had particular episodes that you've had to deal with anything? Because sometimes
Well-
you deal with kind of
Well,
controversial
not
issues.
me particularly, although I read somewhere that there was an episode I wrote that was on TV maybe about 10 or 12 years ago that some people really hate, but it felt real to me, which is that it was when Bart was playing Little League Baseball and they were about to win the big championship, and he made a very bad error. Kind of like, if you're a baseball fan, it was kind of like Bill Buckner's error against the Mets in the 1986 World Series, where he was then like a pariah, and everyone booed Bart, and like they jeered him and said Bart stinks and everything like that. And it got to the point where he was almost suicidal, where he was like on a water tower, like spray painting Bart stinks himself, and he almost fell off. And I read someone recently saying like that was really horrible, and they hated that so much, and they wished that show wasn't on. And I was like, wow, I'm really sorry about that, But to me, it felt everything on The Simpsons is exaggerated anyway, but it felt like that's the kind of mentality that you get. I mean, it was exaggerated because it was a little kid, but I remember when that happens when it was sort of based on what happened to that poor guy in Chicago named Bartman, of all things, Steve Bartman, the guy who messed up the foul ball during the playoffs. So anyway, that's, I mean, but more recently, it was an episode I wasn't involved in at all that they've since pulled, which is the one that was guest starred Michael Jackson. This was from like the second or third season, like back in 1991 or so, and it was a whole episode where the premise of it was that there was a guy who worked with Homer at the nuclear plant, a big doughy white guy who was crazy. I mean, he wasn't working at the plant, he was in a mental hospital. He was crazy, and his delusion was that he was Michael Jackson. And of course, Michael Jackson played the part and did the voice and everything. And they never said he was Michael Jackson because people think I'm crazy because I believe I'm Michael Jackson. And then at the end, he sang a song and everything like that. But since all the most recent stuff about Michael Jackson and that HBO documentary about it, they've since pulled that episode because, you can't look at Michael Jackson the same way anymore. So that's what happens sometimes. Like the world changes around a show that was made 30 years ago, and like the show exists the way it was then, and there's certain jokes that we probably did then that we probably wouldn't do now. I remember seeing also just in terms of like the kids, the bullies bullying Bart or bullying somebody by making a gay joke or something like that was the kind of thing that I remember as a kid that people did. But I think it's just the times have changed enough that we won't write that anymore. I don't think you'll have Nelson the Bully say you're gay or something like that as a negative thing.
Let's get that question in the back with that lovely lady, I believe, has been jumping up and down. Who? Oh, you got it? Oh, you're there? Okay, perfect.
This is more a technical question from a writing standpoint.
Sure.
When you've been in the business as long, I'm sure you've like written dozens and dozens of scripts. How do you go about personally in terms of like, one, tracking them, compiling them, and then when you're talking about reusing something that you wrote a long time ago, but in the industry they're always talking about like killing your babies and knowing when to move on. Like, how do you balance that in terms of like what's good to keep and what's something like I just got to get rid of this?
I don't know. You just sort of know. That's a good question. I mean, I'm very sloppy, I'm very sloppy naturally, like my desk is just full of stuff and crap, and so I'll think of something and write it down somewhere, and then I'll lose it for years. Like even that thing about the Army man, I kind of remembered, I was like, where is that idea written down? It was on some file somewhere. I could be better than that, do better than that. But as far as like you're saying about, that's a true thing of like, just be ready to sacrifice the stuff that doesn't work. So for instance, that joke I told about my dad yelling at the TV, we've tried to work that into F's for Family about 5 different times, and every single time we put it in, and it's dear to me, and I've cut it because it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't work. But now it's currently in episode 4 of next season, and we just watched it yesterday, and it's still there. It makes sense. It works for the character. It does everything it's supposed to do. It's not just there just because I remember this thing my dad saying it. But yeah, you have to sort of ultimately be able to let go of stuff, and that's part of the thing. The experience of being on a writing staff is the ability to let that kind of stuff go, because when you're a writer on a writing staff of a show, you're part of a huge group of everybody, and you write your script. You go off and you spend like a couple of weeks writing your script, and you're really sweating over it, and you get it down, and this is exactly what I want, and you bring it in and you hand it in, and then it belongs to the showrunner, it belongs to everybody else, and then they start cutting it, they start changing it, they say this could be better, we want to punch this up, and that's the most crucial thing, is because it's weird, because being a writer is incredibly ego-driven, because you're saying like, what I think is funny, millions of people will think is funny, so you have to have that kind of ego to say, to even do it in the first place, but then you have to be able to let that go and sort of surrender to the process of what it's like, and when you don't do that, when you become defensive about it, that's when you don't get hired back the next season of the show, because everyone is it's a collaborative thing. You have to let it go. You can't be that person who's saying, no, well, I did it because this. You don't understand. The joke is because of this, or that's the joke of it. That's why. You just have to let it go and sort of surrender to it, and eventually you'll have your own show. And even when you have your own show, like I do, I'm still finding my own stuff. I'm cutting my own stuff. I have to be willing to listen to the rest of the writers saying like, nah, this joke doesn't really work. Because if you don't do that, if you become defensive, if you become combative, if you say like, no, this is why I did it that way, I swear to you, you will not work again, or you will not get hired again until you figure out how to do that, because it's all about being part of a team.
Coming to that, as we unfortunately have to start drawing to a close with Mr. Michael Price, and that was, I think, amazing advice that I tell my students all the time too. When they're writing things, don't just fall in love with it, because even if you're writing for live scripts, you might have your original script, and my writers and directors out there, a lot of times there's 7 rewrites before you even get the Star Wars 1 or 10. So you have your initial, I call it more of the skeleton script, and then you kind of add skin to it, and everyone's kind of involved in the process.
Yep.
Before we just go, since everyone kind of heard your process a little bit too, if you have some words of wisdom to leave by, as
Sure.
a lot of students here are either graduating, in the midst of getting on in their career, some in the midst of trying to sell their animated products, or even if it's not animation, some words of advice of surviving in our lovely industry out there.
I think for me, like I said way at the beginning of when I came here, is that for me, there was nothing else I could see myself doing in my life. Like, if there's anything else you can do that you can make a living at, then think about doing that, because it's so hard. I mean, it seems like it's easy. It might be easier now because there's so much more going on now. I mean, when I first came out here, like I said, there were the three major networks. There was Fox, and there was a little bit of cable. And now, you know, there's a million shows on Netflix and Amazon, and everybody's doing stuff, which that's fantastic. But it's still hard. It's still really, really, really hard. And for me, it was like, I literally was going to either I was going to find some way to do what I wanted to do out here, or I was going to, I don't know what I was going to do. You know, I probably would never have gone back to New Jersey because I didn't want to, you know, go back as a failure. But it was literally like, so I had no other, it wasn't like, oh, I guess I'll just be a lawyer or whatever, or I'll do this or that. You know, I had nothing else. So that made me stick to it and put up with rejection and failure and all those things. Like, I had a crazy day where I had a pitch. I got a pitch at the old Full House, the original Full House, because my agent knew a guy there, and he goes, you can go pitch some stories to Full House. And it was at the Warner Brothers lot. And I ran out there with all my pitches, and I had 11 pitches, and every single one of them they shot down. No, we did that already. No. And in the middle of pitch 8 or so, they said, do you have this kind of car? I'm like, yeah. Well, it's about to get towed because it was like, I parked it in the wrong place on the Warner's back lot. So I had to run and move my car and then come back and hear the rest of my terrible pitches, you know. And so I mean, but it was like, what else was I going to do? I was driving a taxi cab at the time. That was my money job. So yeah, just stick with it, you know. But then also, just like I said earlier, if you have a chance to work on a show, you know, even if it's even to be a PA. The person that gets the lunches, you know, the person that runs around delivering things, do it, because you'll meet somebody there. You know, if you're interested in comedy, or even in writing in general, like, get a writers group together where you're working together, or if you're in comedy, take a class at UCB, you know, join like a sketch team at UCB, you know, because you'll meet somebody there, you'll meet people who will network, who will tell you, hey, I know this guy who's an assistant to an agent over at APA, he's interested in reading stuff. And that's how you'll meet people. That's how you'll get somebody to read your
I
stuff.
always say get in the bubble. You know,
Yeah,
try putting yourself
exactly.
into different areas that are in the bubble.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Mike.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
And thank you all for coming today as well. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. Appreciate it. My name is Mac Terluccio. For those of you that don't know me, for those of you that do, hi, everybody. I want to welcome you to this guest speaker event for Entertainment Business in LA Film School. Really appreciative that you're all here. And without any further ado, here is Professor Lloyd and Michael Price.
Before I introduce my good friend here, I just want to say a little bit of history about Michael Price. Some of you might already know that besides being the executive producer on The Simpsons and writer, which is going on its 30th year this year, right? Okay. He is also creator of the new